Well, we have made it to week 12, and this week we're going to talk about energy conservation for greenhouses. As the cost of fuel continues to go up and the cost of electricity continues to rise, we're always looking for ways to conserve energy, and that's no different than in the greenhouse business. First off, we have to look at the greenhouse structure itself. The first line of defense in efficient heating in the greenhouse is the structure. Of course, newer structures have better seals. Over time, seals wear away, and if you have an older greenhouse, you need to check those seals and replace them as they age. You also want to make sure that you keep roof surfaces clean so that you can maximize the amount of sunlight that reach your plants. Sunlight is essential for plant growth, and if you can keep your roof clean, then your plants should grow better. And then you should also consider a windbreak on the windward side of the greenhouse. This can help reduce the amount of energy that you need to use in order to heat your greenhouse. If you're going to use double poly as a covering or a glazing for your greenhouse, you probably want to invest in a double layer of poly. This helps reduce the heating cost by about 50% compared to single poly coverings. So while it's a little bit more on the front end, it definitely is worth the investment down the road. This double layer of poly has a motor that pumps air in between the two layers, and that air in between the two layers of the poly acts as an insulator. Most of your film will have a thermal value, or all of your film will have a thermal value. Whenever you call to purchase polyethylene, you want to ask the supplier what the thermal value is on that polyethylene. Those values may vary from 30 to 60% heat loss, so you can definitely get an idea of the value and the quality of the poly that you're purchasing. You can also purchase a treated film, which will also help to reduce the heat loss or the infrared heat loss. And finally, films that can reduce water condensation will enhance the light transmission, it will improve heat retention, and it will also help reduce the amount of disease from fungal spores. If you have a glass greenhouse, you could perhaps use poly as an additional covering to increase the amount of heat efficiency of that glass greenhouse. You can cover it with one or maybe even a double layer of poly. As you can see on the screen, if you were to have a glass greenhouse and you covered that glass with a single layer of poly, you can reduce the annual heat cost by 5 to 40%. If you invest in a second layer of poly, the heat loss then is, or the heating cost is then reduced by 40 to 60%. Of course, remember that if you are going to double layer this or single layer this glass greenhouse, there will be a trade-off, because as you increase your energy efficiency, then the light transmission does go down. And it may not be worth it to you because you may need the light transmission, but in most cases you can find a balance in the middle depending on the crop that you grow. Before you get into the dead of winter, you want to make sure that you winterize any greenhouse. A tight greenhouse with few air leaks around vents, fans, and doors will cost less to heat, and that just makes sense. So be sure that as you approach the winter months, you take time to check all of the seals and you check around your fans and your doors to make sure that you don't have air that's just leaking out. When you check your end walls, you want to make sure that your end walls are insulated. These are the walls that you have a clear surface all the way to the peak of the greenhouse, or a flat surface all the way up. You especially want to insulate the north end wall. Most of the time the north end wall is not providing a lot of light for crop production, so you could actually make that wall of something solid like wood. If you wanted to add windbreaks, that would also be a good place to add the windbreak along that end wall. That way you can reduce the amount of energy loss through the north end wall. If you need to insulate the south end wall, or you want to insulate the south end wall, then you will probably just want to use an extra layer of plastic, because you're going to get a lot of sunlight through that south end wall. So you don't want to use wood, but you do want to add some extra insulation so that you're not losing a lot of heat there. If you're in the beginning stages of building a greenhouse, you want to make sure that you take time to consider the foundation. Foundation heat loss can be reduced by at least half through 1 or 2 inches of a polyurethane or polystyrene insulation on the foundation. you want to install that insulation 1.5 to 2 feet deep around the foundation wall, and be sure that you don't leave any gaps or openings. If you are using a structure that it was already established and it didn't have insulation installed during construction, you want to make sure that you check all the gaps or holes around the foundation and fill those in or repair them if you need to. Some greenhouses have a concrete knee wall. If you have that knee wall, you want to put an insulation board to help reduce heat loss around that knee board. You got to keep in mind that sidewall insulation could reduce annual heat by 5 to 10%. And that seems like a small amount as compared to your glazing, but when you add all of these things together, you can really make a difference in the cost of heating your greenhouse. When we look at fans and vents, you want to insulate any secondary fans or vents, but keep in mind that you don't want to cover all the vents. You're going to still need ventilation during the winter months. I made the mistake one year of covering up every vent and every fan in the greenhouse, and we had a lot of problems with powdery mildew that year because the air got stale, we didn't have fresh air, condensation was worse. So don't cover all vents, but if you have a vent that's a secondary vent that you can get away with covering, go ahead and cover that up so that you don't lose heat that way. You also want to make sure that you check the vents if they have louvers over them, that all of that shuts tightly when it's not in use so that you don't lose heat through that method or that manner. In a previous presentation, we mentioned thermal blankets. If you do add a thermal blanket, you can help prevent about 85% of heat loss during the nighttime. You can also reduce the amount of fuel that you need by as much as 30%. Those are pretty significant factors, so you definitely want to look into a thermal blanket. Let's look here at the 3 ways that thermal blankets reduce energy consumption. First of all, they trap a layer of air above that thermal curtain blanket to provide insulation between the greenhouse roof and the thermal blanket itself. The blanket will have aluminum strips, so they will reflect the radiant heat back towards the floor or back towards your plants. And then finally, thermal blankets will reduce the amount of air that you have to keep heated overnight. But remember that you want to use some kind of porous material so that you don't get condensation pooling above that thermal blanket if it were to fall from the greenhouse covering itself. You also want to consider that thermal blankets usually pay for themselves in energy savings within a couple of years. So while it is a cost to you, they will regain that money. You also want to make sure that water lines are located below the blanket or that they are well insulated. If you put your water line outside that thermal blanket and the heat of the greenhouse doesn't reach that water line, you may cause that water line to freeze. Whenever you go in the morning to remove the thermal blanket, because you will want to take it off in the morning so sunlight can reach your plants, you want to open it maybe 6 to 12 inches for about 30 minutes to allow the air to mix. You don't want to have the plants in this really warm environment then just take the thermal blanket off and all of that extra air in the greenhouse that was above the thermal blanket mix in automatically. This would cause a sharp temperature drop and it will not serve your plants well. Finally, if you're having a snowstorm, it seems like you might want to put the thermal blanket on because that'll be a cold time to help keep those plants warm. But if you put the thermal blanket on and snow starts to pile up on top of your greenhouse, it can't melt off, you could cause the greenhouse roof to collapse. So in a snowstorm, be sure you take the thermal blanket on and go ahead and let the heat of the greenhouse heat up the entire greenhouse all the way up to the roof so that you can melt the snow off. If you can't do anything we've talked about this far, you do need to check your heating system for its efficiency. You want to annually check and do some maintenance to your heating system or your furnace. You should probably think about or take note that an 1/8 inch layer of soot can increase fuel consumption by as much as 10%. So just cleaning out the old ashes can reduce your fuel costs. Whenever you're looking at your fuel, be sure that you use the proper fuel for the system that you purchase. You also want to insulate your boiler or any distribution pipes if you have a boiler with distribution pipes. This will just help with maintaining the efficiency of your heating system. Your external air for combustion you're going to need whenever you have a furnace, so you want to make sure that you can get some air into the greenhouse. You probably need to leave about 1 square inch of open space for 2,000 BTUs per hour of heat output. That way that you do get enough external air inside that adequate and efficient combustion can occur. If you're using a radiation surface, you want to clean the heating pipes or any other radiation surface. That way the heat can radiate as well as possible without any dirt as an interference. Then finally, make sure that you check all of your motors and pumps if they are running and they're running to their full potential. We've mentioned horizontal airflow or half fans before, but they are really important in a greenhouse because they will help the air to circulate and keep the heat moving away from your furnace and into the entire greenhouse. It will also help to improve the temperature and the humidity throughout your greenhouse. You don't want your humidity to be really high on one end of the greenhouse and really low at another area. You want to keep that air circulated. Let me make a note here that you want to keep your humidity below 80% if at all possible, because this will help to minimize disease incidences. A few examples of half fans, or a few things to note, is that air speed should be fast enough to circulate air at 2 to 3 cubic feet per minute. So if you had a 28 by 96 greenhouse, if you multiplied that by each other to find your volume, and you multiplied that by 2 cubic feet, you would find that you needed a half fan that would circulate air at 5,376 cubic feet per minute. You also want your fans to be located 2 to 3 feet above the plants. You want them to line up parallel to your sidewalls. And so this way you can keep the air moving around the plants, but you don't want the air necessarily to blow on the plants because this can cause the humidity right on the plants to be lower and cause the leaves to experience some wind burn. So you want the air to flow a couple feet above the plants, and you want to keep that air moving around the greenhouse. In the wintertime, you want to make sure that your half fans are on because this will help to improve the temperature and humidity throughout the greenhouse. When you start to choose a fuel source, if you decide that you're going to use some kind of alternative fuel source, there are a few things you need to look at. First of all, you need to look at the unit cost of fuels. Be sure that you're comparing cost with the same standard. So maybe the dollar amount per million BTU. You definitely want to make sure that when you compare those prices that you convert them to the same unit, or else you're not comparing apples to apples. You also want to look at the dependability of the fuel source. If there's not enough fuel in your area, even though it might be cheaper, or if it's not dependable, then it might not be worth the savings. It might be better for you to go ahead and pay a little bit more to ensure that you have heat all winter long. And then you need to look at the operation costs. Just because you find a fuel that's cheaper doesn't mean that it's cheaper in the long run. The fuel itself might be cheaper, but the cost of the furnace or the cost of operation and cleaning and the other accessories such as pipes to go along with that might cause the actual cost, total cost, to be more. So be sure you compare and think about every. In your book on page 41, you'll see that there's a heating equivalent cost chart. This chart is a little bit dated. It's not up to date as much as we would like it to be because fuel costs change every year, and this is not this year's cost. But you can see that natural gas is going to be cheaper than using propane. And I think that even in years when the dollar value has increased, you'll see that proportionally these fuels are about at the same difference between each other. You can always go online and search for an estimated fuel cost comparison chart and find the most recent greenhouse cost for these. There are also a few growing practices that you can do to help reduce your costs and improve your efficiency. First of all, you can lower the night temperature of a greenhouse. If you lower it by 1 degree, you can lower the heating bill by 2 to 3%. Of course, we don't want to lower the nightly temperature to the point that it causes problems for the plants, but at night your plants don't need the temperature to be as high because they're not receiving sunlight. Therefore, the photosynthesis rate is down, and so the temperature can be less. Temperatures will affect the time required to finish a crop. Therefore, you need to be sure that if you are going to lower the temperature, you know how it will affect a particular crop. Each plant has what's called a base temperature, or that bottom temperature for survival. As you get closer to this base temperature, growth is going to be affected more, so you really need to be sure, again, I don't know how many times I've said this semester, but be sure you know what the requirements are for the crop that you're going to be growing. If you lower the temperature in the greenhouse, you can also cause additional disease problems. So there again, you want to make sure that you don't go too low with this temperature drop, but a few degrees at night probably won't cause a lot of problems. Here you'll see that it talks about spacing plants according to temperature needs. Plants that are placed closer together have a higher likelihood of spreading disease, so you may need to space those out a little bit. You also want to keep those half fans running, that way you don't get cold pockets in the greenhouse. You want to make sure that you keep the greenhouse air well circulated. Then finally, you want to notice that lowering the night temperature could potentially increase production time by 10 to 25%. So if we look at this chart here, or this table, if you were to look on page 44 of your book, you can see this, and it'll tell you that if you were to drop your temperature by 3 degrees, how many days or how much time you would need to allow for that difference. And so you can take some time here, and you'll notice that it's divided by normal air temperature, a lower air temperature at 63 degrees, and normal air temperature at 68, and then you'll have a cool season crop, a warm season crop, and kind of a middle of the road base temperature that we talked about before. And then it'll show you what would happen if you were to adjust those temperatures by a few degrees, how much you would need to allow to let that crop fully develop.